All right, so if the attorneys are ready from both sides, we can go ahead and get started and call the case of United States v. Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Stirrup. Scoring judges, if you could go ahead and look at the two buttons on the lower left side of your screen and turn off your audio and video, and just keep those off until the trial is over and we're going to do some comments. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants, which means the only people on your screen right now should be me and the two advocates. Um, the attorneys are ready. We can go ahead and make appearances, starting with the prosecution.
Yes, Your Honor, the government is ready to proceed. Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Abowd. I'm joined today by my second chair, Jin Wong, who is currently off camera. Together, we represent the United States.
Okay, anything from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Guarnieri, and today I represent the defense along with my co-counsel, Maida Durachetti.
All right, is there anything we need to take up before the court before we get into opening statements?
Yes,
Your Honor. The
Okay,
government has a few pretrial matters to attend to. First, we would like to invoke Rule 615, which states that all witnesses are constructively sequestered.
Okay. Do you have any party representatives we'll start with plaintiff. Is there anybody that's going to stay in the courtroom?
No, Your Honor.
What about the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
Second, the government would like to direct your attention to point 7 of the pretrial order, which states that exhibits 4 through 33 are pre-admitted.
Okay, I understand. And, as such, if you want to put those in front of the jury at any time by sharing screen, you don't have to ask permission to do that. Just go ahead and use it throughout your presentation.
Thank you, Your Honor. In addition, the government would like to direct your attention to Stipulation 14, which states that all items on the joint exhibit list are authentic.
Okay, understood.
And finally, we would like to direct your attention to Stipulation 15, which states that Exhibit 34 is a copy of a petition filed with the Leon County Court in Florida, and the words written in blue were written by the victim, Don Clark.
Okay, and I am familiar with Exhibit 34, so we're good there.
And one last thing, Your Honor. The government would like to request that in the event counsel uses an exhibit that is not pre-admitted, that they would be permitted to screen share that exhibit constructively outside the presence of the jury so that the witness can use it for identification purposes.
That's fine. I think that will help us in evaluating any evidentiary issues that come up and also for the jury to score you along those lines. But just alert the court when you intend to do so. And then in the event that the exhibit is admitted, say it's one of the videos, you don't have to replay the video for us since we'll have already seen it.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the government is ready to proceed.
Okay. Anything from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense requests that in the event that one of our cameras or microphones goes out, that you please interrupt us and let us know so we can remedy the issue.
Absolutely. I'll let you know.
With that, the defense is ready to proceed, Your Honor.
All right. Plaintiff, are you ready to give an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Let me run the park my way or I'm going to kill you. That was the threat the defendant, Kara Bassett, directed towards her husband, Don Clark, in June of 2017. And why did she say it? Because she wanted control of her husband's business, the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. But he wouldn't give it to her. So 2 months later, the defendant took matters into her own hands. And because of that, Don Clark is dead. Now, the government has charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with murder. It's our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the following: that the defendant intentionally and deliberately murdered her husband. Members of the jury, we will meet this burden because the evidence will show that the defendant had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to take her husband's life. Now, in order to understand why the defendant would commit such a heinous crime, we need to take a step back. You're going to learn today that the defendant and her husband lived and worked at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. As the evidence will show, the defendant had a vision for the park. She wanted it to be a sanctuary where the elephants could roam free. But her husband ran the park like a zoo, keeping the elephants in cages and running the park for profit. Members of the jury, you'll learn that the defendant's anger towards her husband caused their relationship to splinter. In fact, the fights, the arguments, and the threats that followed became so severe that the evidence will show Don Clark tried to get a protective order filed against his wife. You'll hear how that during one of their fights, Kara Bassett picked up a vase, hurled it at her husband's head so hard that it shattered to pieces. And you'll hear that how 1 month later, Don Clark disappeared. And while the defendant claims she was worried about his whereabouts, that she didn't know where he was, you're going to see her phone records today. And you'll see that in the entire week after her husband's disappearance, the defendant made no effort to text, made no effort to call her husband. Members of the jury, on August 18th, 2017, the evidence will show that the defendant injected her husband with carfentanil, that she loaded his dead body into a van, and that she drove that van to a swamp where she dumped his body. Members of the jury, you'll learn that she had the means and the opportunity to commit this crime. You're going to learn today that the defendant had access to carfentanil, syringes of a substance so lethal that only drops are required to kill a human being. You'll learn that the defendant had access to the wheelchair and the van that she used to transport her husband's body to the swamp. And you'll learn that forensic evidence collected from the defendant's boots, that wheelchair, and that van put her at every step of the way. Members of the jury, she had the motive, she had the means, and she had the opportunity. That's why at the close of today's case, I'll ask you to find the defendant, Kara Bassett, guilty of the murder of Don Clark. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. And as our bailiff greatly reminded us, for the jurors, just make sure that you are in speaker view. The button is in the top right corner of your screen. And attorneys, I'm sure you're used to this, but make sure that your mics are muted while the others are presenting. So defense counsel, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Unsolved mysteries are for the television. Unanswered questions have no place in a criminal trial. And yet the story the prosecution is telling you today is full of them. And today, the prosecution's case will create more questions than it answered. So let's rewind the story the prosecution has just told you. Back to the opening of the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park in 2011. Newlyweds Don and Kara decided to open a place to protect elephants. And fast forward to 2017, the couple have been successfully running the park for 6 years, until August 19th, 2017, when Kara wakes up and her husband isn't in bed next to her, or when she searches the entire property and she can't find Don. His phone, his wallet, and his car keys are missing as well. But then she checks her phone. She's relieved. She has a message from Don saying he's going out for a while. And Don visits Costa Rica almost every month, so she didn't think anything of it. Until a month passed, until a week passed, and she still hadn't heard from Don. She called the local authorities, and those authorities brought in the FBI, all to answer the question of where is Don Clark? And to this day, nobody has been able to give Kara an answer. Members of the jury, and today the prosecution has the burden of proof. They have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Today, they won't be able to provide sufficient evidence to say that Don Clark is even dead, much less that Kara committed any crime. The prosecution's gonna call FBI agent Steph Branham to the stand. And Steph Branham's gonna tell you about the investigation they conducted. But today you're gonna hear about all of the evidence their investigation ignored. You see, the FBI, well, they decided it was murder. Well, they decided Kara did it, so they handpicked evidence that pointed to her and tried to disregard the evidence that didn't. But today, you're going to see Don Clark's phone records. You'll see that on the day he disappeared, he spoke for almost an hour with an unlisted caller in Costa Rica. You're also going to see that Don Clark had large amounts of cash that was off the books. Cash the FBI couldn't find. Well, today we're going to call Joe Young to the stand to fill in the gaps the prosecution can't. He's going to tell you about what he witnessed during the FBI's investigation, the sloppiness he saw. And he's going to tell you about his trip to Don's property in Hermosa Beach, where he found evidence that Don had been there. Today, the prosecution won't be able to answer the questions they bring upon themselves. Who was calling Don Clark from Costa Rica? What happened to that off-the-books cash? And where is Don Clark? Too many questions will be left unanswered for anything other than a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Before the government calls its first witness, I'm going to ask everybody, especially the jurors, to switch to gallery view. That button's in the top right of your screen. That'll allow you to see both the attorney and the witness at the same time. So as long as there's no matters we need to take up before the opening of the government's case, prosecution, you are free to call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Agent Steph Branham to the stand. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, sir.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Hello, I am Special Agent Steph Branham.
And what do you do for a living, ma'am?
I am a senior special agent with the FBI.
What type of work do you do for the FBI?
I focus on investigating violent crimes, sir.
Were you involved in the investigation into the disappearance of Don Clark?
Yes, I was the lead investigator.
And how did you become involved in this investigation?
On August 25th, 2017, Kara Bassett informed the FBI of her husband's disappearance. At that point, I was assigned the case.
And what was the results of this investigation?
I arrested the defendant.
Now, what steps did you take as a part of your investigation, Agent?
Primarily 3. First, physical searches of 3 different locations, then a GPS report, and finally an interview with the defendant.
You mentioned that you interviewed the defendant. When you interviewed her, did she indicate where she lived?
She did. She mentioned she lived at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
Now, did she tell you when she noticed her husband was missing?
She did. August 18th, 2017.
And Agent, how long after that did she report him missing?
She reported her husband's disappearance on August 25th, around a week later.
And did the defendant indicate to you that she was worried about her husband during that time?
The defendant mentioned that she had searched for him.
Did you find any evidence to doubt that story?
I did. I found that she never made any effort to contact her husband.
Now, ma'am, given the fact that you were doubting the defendant's story, were you able to create a timeline of events of Don Clark's whereabouts on the night he disappeared?
I was.
Mr. Wong, could you please display that timeline? Now, ma'am, when was the last time Don Clark was seen by anybody?
Well, as you can see on this photograph, You can see that at 9 p.m. he was last seen by the defendant.
Now, Agent, you mentioned you tracked GPS data from vehicles as part of your investigation. Were you able to determine from any of those records any activity that happened after 9 o'clock that night?
I was. At 11:14 p.m., Don Clark's vehicle moved from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park to the Big Gum Swamp.
And how long did the van stay at the Big Gum Swamp that night?
Around 45 minutes, sir.
And where did the van travel after that point?
It left the Big Gum Swamp to then go to the Carrie Bell Leone Airport.
Agent, did you find any evidence to suggest that the person driving this van was the defendant?
I did.
And what was that evidence?
I found fingerprints belonging to the defendant, as well as algae on the driver's side of the foot pedal.
Objection. Lack of foundation.
Okay, please explain.
Your Honor, this witness has no expertise in forensic analysis. There's been no foundation laid as to how she knows these fingerprints belong to Kara Bassett.
Okay, response.
Your Honor, I was simply asking the agent what evidence she found suggesting that the defendant was in the car. After that, I was planning to ask her questions about what specifically that evidence was and lay the foundation to how she would know that evidence pointed to the defendant.
Well, we're going to need to lay the foundation for the fingerprint evidence before we can actually introduce it before the jury. If she's an expert and conducted the analysis herself, let's hear that. If there was some other sort of analysis that was performed, let's hear about that first, and then let's hear the conclusion of what that led to. So I'm going to sustain that objection for now.
Motion to strike the testimony regarding fingerprints, Your Honor.
Yes, but if the foundation is laid, certainly it will be able to come in.
Yes, Your Honor.
And Agent, how were you able to determine this information, this evidence about the defendant?
I was able to send it to a forensics lab as per protocol, and then I was able to learn about the results.
Now, Mr. Wong, could you please display that forensic report, Exhibit 5? Agent, could you identify this document?
Yes, of course. This is the forensic report that gave me the details of the trace evidence in Mr. Clark's vehicle.
And specifically, what evidence was included in this report?
I learned about fingerprints, hair samples, and most importantly, algae.
Well, I want to focus on the algae. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Certainly. We found a rare, unique type of algae on the driver's side foot pedal of the vehicle, as well as we found algae on a wheelchair at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park and on the defendant's boots.
Objection. Your Honor, misstating the evidence.
Okay, please explain.
Well, Your Honor, the algae itself is not rare. The document doesn't talk about how common the algae is. It only talks about the commonalities of the two types of algae being present together. Categorizing the algae itself as rare is misstating the evidence when this witness has no knowledge of if these kinds of algae are rare alone, only the knowledge that they are rare together.
Okay, response.
Your Honor, I believe the witness was referring to, when she said algae, the samples that they collected from the defendant's boots, the wheelchair, and the van. And by that, and when she described it as being rare, as you can see on this exhibit, it says rare to see those two types of algae together. I don't believe that's misstating the evidence or misleading to the jury in any way.
Yeah, I think it may just be a confusion as to the usage of the language by the witness. And in either event, I don't think it rises to the 403 standard to be excluded as misstating. But certainly this is an issue for clarification or for attack on cross-examination if you'd like to do that. So I'll give you that opportunity if you choose to do so. But for now, it's overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So you were just talking about the rare combination of algae that you found at the Big Gum Swamp. What evidence did it point to that on the samples that you gathered relating to that algae?
Well, as we saw that it traced back to the Big Gum Swamp in regard to it being a match there, we found that same evidence in the car, Mr. Clark's vehicle, as well as on a wheelchair at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park and on the defendant's boots.
Thank you, Agent. Now, in your investigation, were you able to identify a murder weapon?
I was.
And what was that murder weapon?
Carfentanil.
Objection. A lack of foundation.
Okay, explain.
Well, Your Honor, they've laid no foundation of how she would be aware of carfentanil being a murder weapon. Additionally, they've laid no foundation as to how she's aware there even was a murder. They've laid no foundation of a crime scene, of a body, of any forensic reports showing that carfentanil could have been used to kill him. There's been no foundation laid as to how carfentanil even comes into play in today's case.
Okay, response.
Your Honor, we've laid the foundation that this witness conducted a search of the property, interviewed eyewitnesses, and it's from that she learned of this substance, carfentanil. As to whether or not her husband, whether or not Don Clark was murdered, we have laid the foundation that demonstrated that this agent determined throughout her investigation, due to the suspicious evidence regarding Don Clark's disappearance, that she was investigating this as a potential murder, and therefore it would be natural for her to search for a potential murder weapon in this case.
Okay, anything further from defense?
Your Honor, if they're trying to assert that carfentanil could have been used as a murder weapon, they need to lay the foundation as to how this witness knows of any dangers of carfentanil or how she knows carfentanil could be potentially dangerous to humans.
So what I'll do here is I think the witness is within her rights to call this a murder as part of her investigation. But I would like to hear foundation as to why this is the murder weapon before we actually call it that. So if you want to ask her if she searched for a murder weapon and then talk about how she got to this drug as that's fine. But we need to walk through that foundation first before we just call it that.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent, did you find anything on the grounds that could have been used to kill Don Clark?
Yes, we found syringes of carfentanil, a lethal substance, on the property. We found that there are 24 syringes that were supposed to be there, but one of these syringes was missing.
Thank you, Agent. Now, I actually want to take a look at those syringes of carfentanil. Mr. Wong, if you could please display those exhibits. Could you please identify these two documents?
Of course. Exhibit 18 is a photograph of a syringe of carfentanil, and Exhibit 17 is the material safety data sheet of the substance carfentanil itself.
And what does this material safety data sheet say about the danger levels of the substance carfentanil?
If you look at this document, it shows that the danger level is grave, that it's 5,000 more times more toxic than heroin, and that it's fatal if even 1 milligram of more is swallowed or injected.
And did the defendant have access to this carfentanil?
She did.
And did you ever ask her if she was aware how dangerous this substance was?
Yes, in an interview.
And what did she say?
She laughed, brushed it off, and mentioned that only a few drops would be needed to kill someone.
Now, Agent, were you able to identify a potential motive for why Mrs. Bassett would have killed her husband?
Yes, sir, 2.
What were those 2 motives?
The first is the fact that Kara Bassett and Don Clark would have issues over how the elephant park was run, and the second is that Don Clark's assets totaled to $8 million.
Agent, you mentioned they had issues over the way the elephant park was run. How in your investigation did you determine whether or not those issues were of significance?
I reviewed a letter from Mandy Tuminelli, that's Don Clark's attorney, and I learned that Don Clark had wanted to file a restraining order against the defendant.
Thank you, Agent. No further questions.
Ross?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Branham, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to start by talking to you about that syringe you mentioned on direct examination. In your investigation, you found no forensic evidence as to where that syringe was, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
You don't know who took it, correct?
That's correct.
And you don't know when it went missing.
Correct.
I'd like to talk to you about that van on direct examination. You have no eyewitnesses that put Kara Bassett driving the van that night.
That's true.
You have no eyewitnesses putting Dawn in that van that night.
That's true.
You have no eyewitnesses that put the defendant at Big Gum Swamp.
That's true.
I'd like to talk to you about the testing you did. You said on direct examination that you tested for algae at Big Gum Swamp.
Yes, ma'am.
And Big Gum Swamp is a freshwater area, correct?
That is correct.
You were testing for a microscopic algae.
Yes.
If my co-counsel could put Exhibit 25 up on the screen. Well, this is a picture of the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
That's true.
Well, this is where Kara Bassett worked every day.
Yes, ma'am.
You said on direct examination that the algae was on her boots was similar to at the Big Gum Swamp.
Yes, ma'am. That's what the data forensic sheet reported.
But you didn't test for this algae at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
No, ma'am. We did not see it was necessary.
Well, the watering hole is a freshwater area, correct?
That is true.
And you can't see this microscopic algae with the naked eye.
No, ma'am.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about the search of Big Gum Swamp. When you searched the property, you sent dogs to look for Don Clark's scent, correct?
Yes, of course.
Well, these dogs didn't find Don Clark's scent, correct?
That is true.
Your team found no forensic evidence tying Don Clark to Big Gum Swamp.
No, but we had circumstantial evidence to show that he was there.
Well, you didn't find any algae on any of Don Clark's clothing.
That's correct.
It's been 3 years since Don disappeared, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Nobody has found any of Don's personal effects at Big Gum Swamp.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
And no witnesses have been able to place Kara or Don at Big Gum Swamp.
Yes, no witnesses have, however, evidence has been able to.
Well, talking about that algae, you don't know when the algae got on the defendant's boots.
That's correct.
You don't know if those two kinds of algae even got on her boot at the same time.
Again, that is correct.
I'd like to talk to you about that letter from Mandy to Minnelli from direct examination. In this letter, it says that Don Clark had cash that was off the books, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
He was planning to purchase some properties in Costa Rica with this cash, correct?
That's what this letter states, yes.
It says that Miss Bassett was unaware of the purchase.
Yes, that's what this states.
And your investigation never recovered that off the books cash, correct?
That is correct.
I'd like to direct your attention to Don Clark's call logs. My co-counsel could zoom in. It says here that on August 18th, he sent a text, Don Clark's phone number sent a text to Kara Clark, correct?
Yes.
Said, want to talk to you about a trip to CR.
Yes.
And Kara's phone number responded saying, okay, I'm fine with whatever, with the heart emoji, correct?
Yes, that's true.
Well, I'd like my co-counsel to move on to these two text messages. These were also sent on August 18th.
Yes.
These were sent from an unlisted number in Costa Rica.
Yes.
Well, Don Clark also had a phone call with this number from Costa Rica, correct?
Yes, that is what the data report showed.
The report shows that that call lasted for 52 minutes.
Yes, ma'am.
If my co-counsel could please put that up on a timeline. Well, this timeline accurately represents when those texts and calls were made, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Both of these communications were on the day Don disappeared.
Yes.
You weren't able to identify who this person was on the other end.
That is correct, as it was an unlisted number.
Well, if you could direct your attention to Exhibit 20. Well, this is a picture of Kara Bassett's phone, correct?
Yes.
It says that she received a text message from Don's phone saying going out for a while, correct?
It does.
This was sent on August 18th.
Yes.
If my co-counsel could put that up on the timeline. This was sent at 11 p.m., correct?
Yes. Around 11 p.m.
Well, this is the last communication to come from Don Clark's phone.
Yes, ma'am.
And it was after the last time the defendant said she saw Don Clark, correct?
That's true.
I'd like to talk to you about the end of your investigation. At the end of your investigation, you were missing the alibis for several park staffers, weren't you?
Yes, ma'am. We didn't deem that necessary as we did not see a motive.
But these park staffers had access to the carfentanil, correct?
That is correct, ma'am.
You were also missing an alibi for Lisa Clark, Don's ex-wife.
Yes, ma'am.
Lisa Clark refused to be interviewed by your team.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about the third question. You couldn't identify that unlisted caller, could you?
No, we were not able to.
You never went down to Costa Rica yourself to figure out who it was.
We did not deem it necessary, no, ma'am.
You didn't find that missing syringe.
Oh, no, we did not.
And you didn't find Don Clark's body.
No, ma'am.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay. Is there any redirect of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Branham, Ms. Guarnieri mentioned on direct examination, on cross-examination, phone calls from Costa Rica. Now, in any part of your investigation, did you determine if any of Don Clark's vehicles were missing?
Yes, we did not find that they were.
And so, did you investigate to see if Don Clark had in fact gone to Costa Rica?
Yes, of course.
And even though all of his vehicles were accounted for, were you able to find any evidence suggesting that Don Clark was alive in Costa Rica?
We found no evidence of that, sir. We found no bank records or text messages that he used or sent after he disappeared.
And in the entire year that you performed your investigation, did you hear from a single eyewitness who claims to have seen Don Clark?
No, sir, not personally.
Now, finally, I'd like to add, opposing counsel brought up Lisa Clark on cross-examination. Were you able to determine your investigation if Lisa Clark had access to the syringe of carfentanil?
Yes, sir.
And did she have access to that?
No, sir, she did not work at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
And did Lisa Clark have access to the park van that left the property on the night in question?
No, sir, as well as we never found her fingerprints, as you could have seen in the forensic report.
Thank you, Agent. No further questions.
Okay, anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor. We have no more questioning for this witness.
Okay. May the witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Branham. Prosecution, is there anything left to take up before we proceed to the defense's case?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the government rests our case.
All right, defense counsel, are you ready to proceed with your case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Joe Young to the stand.
Okay.
Can you see and hear me okay?
Sure can, ma'am.
Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Well, y'all, my name's Joe Young.
And Mr. Young, where are you from?
I was born and raised in a little town in Alabama, Greenbow, but I mostly grew up on the shrimp boat.
Mr. Young, what do you do for a living?
Well, gosh, I made my mama proud. I'm on TV.
Could you describe some of your previous work?
Sure. There's one show you may have heard of. It's called Naked and Afraid in a Jungle.
Do you know Kara Bassett?
I do, ma'am. We were making a documentary about her. We was calling it The Elephant Queen.
What was this documentary about?
Well, it was about her work at the park and her elephants.
While you were filming this documentary, did you get to know Don Clark?
I did. He was a great guy. We always talked about trips we were going on, of the shrimp business. He actually reminded me of a good friend of mine, Bubba.
When was the last time you saw Don Clark?
I last saw him on August 18th.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about August 18th. Were you at the park that day?
I was, ma'am. We were filming the Elephant Queen. It was going real well.
Did you see anything out of the ordinary with Kara that day?
I don't reckon I did, ma'am.
And did you witness any altercations between Kara and Don on that day?
I don't reckon so.
Did you see Don Clark on that day?
I did, ma'am. We were talking about a trip I was going on. I was heading down to Mexico. They have great shrimp there.
Could you describe Don's behavior during your conversation?
Well, at first he was fine. And then he looked down at his phone and his face turned white. He was sweating more than a sinner in church. He said he had to go deal with something and just walked off.
If my co-counsel could put Exhibit 21, Don's text messages, up on the screen. Have you been shown this before trial today?
I have, ma'am.
Or any of these calls or texts at the time you saw Don's behavior change?
I see something around 6 p.m. I was talking to Clark then. That's when he was so scared.
Could you tell the court who the owner of the phone he was communicating with was?
It says it was from Costa Rica. Real nice place.
My co-counsel could go to the timeline. At about what time, in relation to the timeline, did you see Don's behavior change?
Like I said, it was 6 p.m.
Does this timeline accurately reflect what you remember from that night?
I reckon it does.
Have you had any communication with Don since that day?
No, ma'am. He just up and left.
I'd like to go back.
Did.
I'd like to go back to those text messages. You could look at call number 2. Do you know who Lisa Clark is?
Lisa Clark? Oh, she was his ex-wife. Real nasty woman.
And did you ever witness any fights between Lisa and Don?
Oh, yeah, they would fight all the time. Every time she saw him, she'd go pitch a big hissy fit. It was a mess.
If my co-counsel could put those text records up one last time. Can you see the text messages on the screen?
I can, ma'am.
Do you know what CR means?
I don't know for sure, but I reckon it's Costa Rica.
Do you know of any properties Don Clark had in Costa Rica?
Oh, yeah, this real nice house down there. It was pretty nice if you ask me.
Did Don go to this house frequently?
I would say so, yeah.
Did you ever go to Don Clark's house in Costa Rica?
I actually did in June of 2018.
Were you able to get inside of Don's house when you went to Costa Rica?
I did. I snuck into the window.
What did you see after you snuck into the house?
Well, the place was spotless, clean as a whistle. And the fan was on, it looked kind of suspicious if you ask me.
When you were in Costa Rica, did you see the FBI investigating Don's disappearance?
No, ma'am.
Did you ever see the FBI investigating Don's disappearance?
I did. It was while we were filming The Elephant Queen. We have a whole episode about Don Clark.
Did you witness anything in particular about the FBI's investigation?
Well, I mean, I actually saw him, picking up stuff. He didn't have any gloves on. I mean, that's kind of sloppy.
Do you remember any of the objects they were holding without gloves?
Some sort of needle jabby thingamajig.
Could that have been an elephant tranquilizer?
Yeah, it looked like it. It had some highfalutin name like carfentanil.
Were you ever interviewed by the FBI?
Not really. I mean, they asked me only a couple questions, and I was there all the time. But no,
Did you see any of the other park staffers who weren't interviewed by the FBI?
there were a couple that I never saw.
When the FBI was investigating, how much footage did you have of the elephant park?
Let's see. Probably about 2,000 hours.
Did the FBI ever request to see this footage while they were investigating?
No, ma'am.
Did the police ever request to see this footage in the investigation?
No, ma'am. I thought they would have, but didn't want to see a single clip from that.
Did anyone ask to see this footage during the investigation into Don Clark's disappearance?
I don't reckon they did. No, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Young. No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Young, you talked on direct examination about visiting Don Clark's vacation home. Just to be clear, you were there for an entire week, weren't you?
I did. I was there for a whole week. Loved the shrimp in Costa Rica.
During that time, you never saw Don Clark leave the house, did you?
I never saw anyone leave, no.
And during that time, you never saw anyone go into that house, did you?
Other than me, I didn't see anyone.
And in the house, there was no food, was there?
Yeah, no.
There was no
Feel
toiletries
bad.
in that house?
No toiletries, no.
And in the entire time you were in Costa Rica, you never saw Don Clark, did you?
No, I don't reckon I saw him.
Now, I'd like to shift focus and talk about your relationship with the defendant, Kara Bassett. You have quite a lucrative relationship with the defendant, don't you?
Well, I do make that Elephant Queen documentary for her. I sure do.
And you're paid $5,000 a month for your services. Isn't that correct?
I was before she got arrested.
And you worked at the park doing that job for 3 years?
Yes, sir. I was
That's
doing my job. Filming the
180,000.
documentary.
I apologize, sir. And so that's $180,000 paid to you by the defendant. Isn't that correct?
Well, I ain't the smartest man, so I'll trust your math on that.
And even you would agree that the defendant has been very generous to you. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was happy to be hired to film the documentary.
And in fact, you were offered 20% of any profits that the documentary made. Isn't that correct?
Yep. So whoever we sold it to, I got a cut of that.
And now you're aware that a streaming service is offering Mrs. Bassett $10 million for that documentary. Isn't that correct?
I reckon so.
And so as that stands, you stand to make $2 million from your relationship with Kara Bassett. Isn't that correct?
From my work with her, yeah.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about the relationship between Don Clark and Kara Bassett. You're aware that they had disagreements about the way the park was run.
Well, I mean, at first they went together like peas and carrots. I mean, they're a lot better than me and my
Actually,
girl.
move to strike. The witness's statement is unresponsive. I was only asking if he was aware that they had disagreements, and then he went on to elaborate about the nature of their relationship.
That motion will be denied. This is cross-examination, so the onus is on you to control the witness, and to the extent that it gets out of control, I'll step in at that point, but we're not there yet.
Yes, Your Honor. You're aware that the defendant and her husband had several fights about the way the park was run. Isn't that correct?
They had their little squabbles, yeah.
Well, you're aware that Don Clark wanted to run the park like a zoo.
Yeah, zoo.
He kept the elephants in cages.
He did. Big metal cages.
But on the other hand, the defendant, Kara Bassett, told you that she wanted this park to be a sanctuary for the elephants. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's part of what we're filming in the Elephant Queen, talking about, how she wanted the elephants.
She was extremely passionate about protecting elephants, wasn't she?
Exactly. That's what a whole Elephant Queen's about.
And while you say their fights were insignificant squabbles, you're aware that Don Clark actually filed a protective order against his wife.
Well, I was shown a little bit about that. I don't really know anything about it.
Well, you were shown that protective order on 64 Minutes, the show, weren't you?
I was briefly, yeah.
And Mr. Wong, could you display Exhibit 34? But before you do, Your Honor, I would request that this is constructively outside the presence of the jury until it is admitted into evidence.
Sure, we can display it for foundation.
And Mr. Young, directing your attention to the blue ink portion of this section on the second page, you recognize that that's Don Clark's handwriting. Isn't that correct?
It looks like it. He couldn't spell worth a darn.
Your Honor, at this time, the government moves this redacted version of Exhibit 34 into evidence, only including this paragraph written by Don Clark and his signature at the bottom.
So just before there's an objection, I just want to be clear about what we're talking about here. So the only thing that you're going to introduce to the jury are these statements in blue and his signature. You're not going to introduce any of the context about where these statements are coming from?
Your Honor, the only context is that it's coming from a protective order that he filed against his wife, but that's already on the record.
Okay. So opposing counsel, is there any objection to these statements coming in the context that they arise from a protective order?
Yes, Your Honor. We object to hearsay as well as improper character evidence.
Okay,
let's start with the hearsay first. Explain that.
Yes, Your Honor. As to the hearsay objection, any testimony regarding the statements from Kara Bassett are not hearsay under Rule 801D2, admission of party opponent. And then as for Don Clark's statements, they fall under the exception to hearsay under Rule 804 due to Don Clark being unavailable as a witness. Specifically, they fall under the exception 804B2, which states that a statement under the belief of imminent death is an exception to the rule against hearsay. Specifically, in this statement, you see that Don Clark writes, "This is the second time Kara has gotten angry enough to threaten to kill me." And at the end, he says, "She took my revolver and hid it. I'm afraid she's going to kill me in my sleep." In this testimony, Don Clark is afraid for his life due to the threats he received from his wife and the circumstances he describes in this document. And for that reason, this falls under an exception to hearsay under Rule 804B2.
Okay. Defense counsel, first off, as to statements of Kara Bassett, do you have any disagreement as to those being a party opponent statement?
Not to the statements of Kara Bassett, Your Honor. However, to Don Clark's writing, we believe it does not fall under the statement under belief of imminent death.
Okay, why not?
Oh, well, Your Honor, this was the petitioner signature shows that it was on June 20th, 2017, and he disappeared on August 18th, 2017. And this has to be when they believed in this case, it's with the statement under belief of imminent death, it states that for the prosecution believed their declarant's death to be imminent. However, Don Clark lived 2 months at least after this, making it not his imminent death, as they have no evidence to show that this statement was one of the last things he made before he died. And Your Honor, we still object as it's improper character evidence.
Okay, we'll take up that character evidence in a moment, but prosecution.
May I respond?
Yes.
So specifically to the distinction opposing counsel drew to when this statement was made and when he actually died, we don't believe that's relevant in determining if this exception applies, because this rule states belief of impending, a statement made under the belief of impending death. It doesn't matter when he actually ended up disappearing or dying. In this statement, you can clearly see that he states, "I'm afraid she's gonna kill me in my sleep." It's his belief that his death is imminent that makes this statement fall under Rule 804b2.
Okay. I am inclined to rule against you on the dying declaration exception. The traditional application of that rule is in a moment where death is practically certain. There's no evidence here that there was a gun to his head when he wrote this or anything like that. He wasn't bleeding out at the time. Certainly, he may have had a generalized fear of dying in the future, but that death I don't think falls under the imminent requirement. If there's any other exception to this language or another rule you want to offer, you're certainly welcome to do that.
Your Honor, well, in that case, if you overrule that exception, we'll move on with the testimony.
Okay. Well, in that case, the objection is sustained and that evidence will be excluded.
Now, Mr. Young, you're aware that the defendant and her husband had several fights about the way the Elephant Park was run, aren't you?
Like I said, they had their fights. She get madder than a wet sitting hen sometimes.
And you're aware that 1 month before Don Clark disappeared, they had a particularly intense fight. Isn't that correct?
I wasn't say it's particularly intense, no.
Well, you witnessed Kara Bassett pick up a vase and throw it at her husband's head, didn't you?
Objection, improper character evidence.
Okay, please explain that.
Your Honor, they're using this testimony to show that she was violent at one point, so it's more likely that she could have been violent at another, which is the very definition of improper character evidence under Rule 404.
Okay. For what purpose are you using this evidence, counsel?
Your Honor, not for propensity purposes, Your Honor. Rather, we're using the testimony regarding Miss Bassett being so angry that she went to the extent of throwing a vase at her husband's head to demonstrate that she had a motive, which falls under Rule 404b2.
Okay. Is there anything to tie together the reason that she got angry at this point, that motive also existing at the time of the alleged murder?
Yes, Your Honor. In the circumstance in which Mrs. Bassett threw the vase at her husband's head, the reason she threw it was because they were arguing about ownership of the park. They were arguing about that exact issue, and showing to the extent to which she was angry about that issue again goes to her motive.
Okay. Response from defense counsel.
Your Honor, there's no evidence that Kara Bassett and Don Clark had this kind of argument on August 18th, the day he was allegedly murdered. Therefore, this evidence can't be going to show murder motive, as there's not a foundation laid that on the same day they're alleging he was killed, they had the same kind of argument.
Okay. Response from the state.
Your Honor, whether or not there were any fights about this issue on the day of doesn't mean that it's not motive to show the reasons behind why Mrs. Bassett would have murdered her husband. And we have laid the foundation to show that they had an ongoing dispute, including several fights, and one of which is this one. And so I don't believe that testimony has to match up with something exactly that happened on the day of question to show the fact that this defendant had the motive to kill her husband.
Okay, I certainly think we're walking a fine line here between propensity and a permissible purpose. However, given that this motivation was an ongoing incident, which obviously prosecution is alleging culminated in the murder, I don't see these as separate incidents which are used to prove propensity. I do think we're close enough to motive to allow it in. However, I will offer a jury instruction constructively for them to not use it for propensity purposes.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, you're aware that during this fight about the elephant sanctuary, Kara Bassett picked up a vase and hurled it at her husband's head.
Yeah, she just picked it up and chucked it at him.
That vase shattered to pieces. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, hit the wall.
They were arguing about the elephant park.
I reckon so.
Because Mrs. Bassett wanted to turn it into a sanctuary, didn't she?
Well, that's what she told me, yeah.
But Don Clark never changed the park into an elephant sanctuary while he was owning it. Before he disappeared, did he?
Not before he up and left, no.
Now, Mr. Young, you're aware that after Mr. Clark disappeared, Kara Bassett did take control of the park. Isn't that correct?
I believe so, yes, sir.
And after she took control, she turned it into the baby elephant sanctuary. Isn't that correct?
That's what it's called now.
And that's the park that she always wanted. Isn't that right?
I believe so.
Thank you, Mr. Young. No further questions.
Okay, is there any redirect from defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Young, could you describe generally what you witnessed of Dawn and Clark's relationship together?
Well, I'd say they had a pretty good relationship. Like they're like peas and carrots together. Certainly a lot better than me and my girl, Jenny.
Thank you, Mr. Young. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, anything further from the state?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. This witness may be excused, and at this time, the defense rests.
All right, thank you, Mr. Young. Are both sides ready to proceed to closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense is ready to proceed.
The government is ready to proceed as well, Your Honor.
Okay, we will now proceed to closing arguments. If everyone, including our jurors, would please switch back to speaker view. And also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, our jurors are free to go ahead and score the witnesses on their ballots as well. State, the floor is yours.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. She wanted the park. She wanted the money, so she needed her husband dead. You see, Kara Bassett lived for the elephant park. She had dedicated her life to protecting the safety of her elephants, and she detested the way her husband ran this park, the way he kept them in cages. So, members of the jury, she killed him. Today, the government has charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with murder. It's our responsibility to prove the following: that the defendant intentionally and deliberately murdered her husband. Members of the jury, we have met this burden today because the evidence has shown that the defendant had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to take her husband's life. You learned today that you have learned today, members of the jury, that the defendant had the motive. It's simple. Dawn Clark had everything that she wanted: complete control and ownership over the Tallahassee Elephant Park, and $8 million in assets and cash. You learned today how on August 18th, she killed her husband, injecting him with elephant tranquilizer, transporting his body into a van, which she drove to the Big Gum Swamp and dumped his body. Members of the jury, you'll learn that she had all of the means and the opportunity to commit this crime. You learned today that the defendant had access to carfentanil, a synthetic drug so powerful that only a few drops are necessary to kill a human being. And when asked about that carfentanil, what did Mrs. Bassett say? She laughed and said that only a few drops would be enough to kill a man. You learned today that the defendant had access to a wheelchair that she used to transport the Dawn Clark's body, that she had access to the van, the park van that left the property that night. And members of the jury, why is that significant? Because the defendant claims that she never went to Big Gum Swamp. But the forensic evidence puts her at every step along the way. You see, the FBI discovered that there is a rare and unique form of algae at the Big Gum Swamp, and that algae was a direct match to algae found on the defendant's boots, the defendant's wheelchair, and the driver's side floor of the defendant's van. Members of the jury, she had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to take her husband's life. Now, in a moment, opposing counsel is going to get up here and try to convince you that Kara Bassett is just the most unlucky person you've ever met. That she's so unlucky that her husband just decided to disappear one day. That she's so unlucky that she happened to have no alibi. That she's so unlucky that she was the only person present on the property when he disappeared. That she's so unlucky that she had access to every element of the crime. And that she's so unlucky that the exact same type of algae, the exact specific combination, just happened to get on her boots, on her wheelchair, and on the driver's side floor of her van. But members of the jury, it's just common sense. No one has luck like that. She had the motive, she had the means, and she had the opportunity to take her husband's life. Find her guilty. Thank you.
All right, defense.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, today, the prosecution's case has created more questions than it answered. The prosecution just told you a very elaborate story, but it's nothing more than that. A story. It's a story that's filled with guesses and questions they cannot answer. Members of the jury, today the prosecution had the burden of proof. They needed to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt the highest burden in the U.S. justice system, that Kara is guilty. Today, they haven't provided sufficient evidence to say that Dawn Clark is even dead, much less that Kara is guilty of any crime. Today, you heard about the FBI's investigation. You heard about all of the evidence they ignored or didn't even consider because it couldn't point to Kara. Opposing counsel just told you that Kara drove that van on the night of August 18th. But what he didn't tell you is there are absolutely no eyewitnesses that put her in the van that night. What he didn't tell you is that they have no idea when her fingerprints got in that van. He also told you about an algae. Two different kinds of algae that are uncommon together. But you see, they can't tell you when that algae got on the boots, got on the wheelchair, or got in the van. They can't even tell you that those two kinds of algae didn't get there at the same time. They can't tell you that it isn't from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park because they failed to test the place Kara worked at every day. Today, the prosecution also hypothesized that Dawn Clark's body is in the Big Gum Swamp. But it's been 3 years since Dawn disappeared, and there's been absolutely no evidence of him or his personal effects at that swamp. You heard that the FBI sent a team of dogs to look for Dawn Clark's scent. And when the dogs returned, without finding evidence of Dawn Clark's scent, they concluded that his body had to have been at the swamp. Finally, they told you that Dawn Clark was poisoned with a tranquilizer. But they don't know when that tranquilizer went missing. They don't know who took it. They don't know if it was even used on Dawn. They can't tell you today with certainty that Dawn Clark was poisoned. Members of the jury, the FBI's investigation has created more questions than it answered. And today you heard about all of the evidence they tried to disregard because it didn't point to Kara. You saw Don Clark's phone records today. Ladies and gentlemen, you saw that on the day he disappeared, he sent a text to Kara about their property in CR, Costa Rica. Kara said she was fine with it. You then saw text messages from an unlisted number in San Jose, Costa Rica. These text messages were at 6 p.m. and he immediately called that number and spoke with them for 52 minutes. And yet the FBI couldn't identify that person. And finally, you saw a letter from Mandy Tuminelli, a letter that showed you that Don Clark had cash that was off the books, a money Kara didn't know about, money the FBI's investigation didn't account for. Today, we called Joe Young to the stand. Joe Young told you about the sloppiness he witnessed in the FBI's investigation, how they were handling evidence without gloves on multiple occasions, and how he was never interviewed, how he had 2,000 hours of footage that was never considered. The FBI failed to interview all possible suspects. You see, they didn't interview Lisa Clark. Lisa Clark was Don's ex-wife who he fought with on dozens of occasions. But Lisa refused to cooperate with their investigation. She wasn't an easy target. Kara was. Kara cooperated with them at every point in their investigation, speaking with them almost a dozen times, not knowing that they were going to try and pin her for a crime she didn't commit. Members of the jury, today all the prosecution has done is leave you with questions. Questions they have not answered. First, who was calling Don Clark from Costa Rica? Second, has Don been to his property in Costa Rica? They can't tell you. What was happening with that off-the-books cash? It was never recovered. What else was Don Clark hiding from Kara? And the obvious question of where is Don Clark? Today, no witness today has been able to tell you where Don Clark is, or that he's even dead. Members of the jury, all of these questions that the prosecution cannot answer leave only one possible verdict. That's why we ask you find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
All right, is there a rebuttal from the state?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
May it please the court. In her closing statement, defense counsel went through several alternative explanations to Don Clark's disappearance, claiming that those are the reasonable doubts that prove that Mrs. Bassett is not guilty. But members of the jury, I want to take a closer look at some of the things opposing counsel brought up today. The first thing she mentioned was Costa Rica. Because Don Clark got texts from Costa Rica on the night of his disappearance, opposing counsel is trying to tell you that Don Clark somehow magically transported his body to his vacation home in Costa Rica, because we know he didn't get there through any of his vehicles, because his plane remained at the airport. All his vehicles were either at the airport or at the property. But members of the jury, even if we make that leap of faith and assume that Don Clark was in Costa Rica, you heard today from the defense's own witness, Joe Young, who said that there were absolutely no signs of life. There was no food, there were no toiletries, and in the entire week that Joe Young was at Don Clark's home, he saw nobody coming in and out of the house. And in addition to that, Agent Branham did look into those investigations. She did talk to the authorities in Costa Rica, and she found that there were no sightings, no reports, no evidence to suggest that Don Clark was in fact alive. Now, another story that they tried to tell you today is that it was Lisa Clark, Don Clark's ex-wife, but members of the jury, there is absolutely no evidence that Lisa Clark had access to the syringe of carfentanil, that she had access to the Parks van, that she had access to the wheelchair. And there's no forensic evidence that ties Lisa Clark to every element of the crime. Members of the jury, let's just believe that what opposing counsel told you was true. That one day, Kara Bassett just woke up to find her husband missing. I mean, and they tell you at first she wasn't worried because she thought her husband was in Costa Rica, but at a certain point, she had to have gotten worried because at a certain point, she called the authorities. But members of the jury, we learned today that she didn't once try to text or try to call her husband in the entire week after his disappearance. And why is that? It's because she had no unanswered questions. She knew exactly where her husband was because she was the one who killed him. She had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit this crime. Find her guilty. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Judges should go